Welcome back, everybody, to Edge of the Rabbit Hole. I'm author and ghost historian Mike Ricksecker. With me, as always, my co-hostess Victoria Munday, and down in the chat room. Oh, wait, we don't have Quarantine Ghost anymore as our chat moderator. So,
Oh
um,
no.
yeah, well, we announced that last week. Quarantine Ghost had left during the holidays, so you guys behave down there since we don't have a chat moderator.
Uh-oh.
It's going to be a free for all down there. So I'll try to get your questions as best as I can, but hopefully we'll have a chat moderator here again soon. But we have a fantastic guest with us this evening. Prolific author Morgan Daimler is with us. 35 books to her credit, a number on fairies and Irish myth and folklore, which we're going to be talking about this evening. We are really, really fascinated by this subject since, of course, we have the tour to Ireland this summer that is coming up. Still have a couple of openings left. If a few of you still want to jump on that, we would love to have you with us. But without further ado, Morgan, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. So, I guess first and foremost, all these books that you've written, you do have fiction books as well, which is absolutely fascinating. What sparked your interest in this subject?
I think it was a combination of things. I had some personal experiences when I was a child, and I have family connections to Ireland and the Irish American diaspora, over here, and sort of as I got a little older, I really got interested in researching the original folklore and the older stories to kind of give some context to everything. And then it sort of goes from there once you get into it. It's such a fascinating subject.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. Now, you had mentioned just before we went live that you're not actually supposed to call them fairies. So what what are you supposed to call them?
Yep. It's a very old belief, and you find this in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, kind of all over that general area, and even other places like Iceland, that you don't want to call them by particular names like fairy because it might offend them. And there's this idea that they could be passing by invisibly at any time, so you might not be aware that they're there. And if you say something offensive to them or use a term that they don't like, there could be negative consequences. So instead, people use euphemisms. And these would be things like the good neighbors, the good folk, the other crowd, the gentry, the shining ones, fair folk.
Oh.
There's so many of them, honestly.
So is fairy considered derogatory then? Or
It just seems to be a term that they don't like. I don't think anyone successfully interviewed them to find out why they don't like it.
I was just outside. I mean,
That is absolutely fantastic that you mentioned that you don't think anybody's interviewed them to find out because I certainly believe in fairies or fairy folk or whatever you do want to call them, and I've seen what I believe are them. And so, I've tried to do some research on fairies and fairy folklore and what have you. And when I pick up a lot of books, and unfortunately I haven't picked up yours yet, on this subject, there's a lot of there's a lot of lore and myth and what have you, and there are a lot of people describe their social structure and all of that. And my question has always been, okay, who sat down with the fairies to find out what this social structure is? So it has to be very challenging to be in your position, trying to get as much fact, because somewhere in there is a nugget of truth. So how much of a challenge is that for you to try to piece all this together, with all this myth and folklore mixed into it?
I mean, I look at it as fun, so I don't know if I would say it was a challenge, but there definitely is a huge amount of it. And, whereas we tend to kind of look at them in this sort of wide-ranging way across multiple cultures, really, when you get into like the individual folklore, like Irish folklore versus Scottish versus Welsh, it's not exactly the same. There's differences. So that's also really fascinating. But you just sort of have to be patient and just go through, because there is so much of it. And there's, there's modern anecdotal accounts, there's older anecdotal accounts, there's mythology, as you mentioned, there's hundreds of years of recorded folklore. There's good sources and bad sources and all sorts of things out there. So it is a lot to go through, but it is such a fascinating subject, and there's so much to it. Like I said, once you get interested in it, it just kind of pulls you in, and then much like the name of your show here, it's that rabbit hole that once you go down it, you just keep going.
So the good neighbor, or fairy, is that like an umbrella term?
Yeah.
Would that you consider gnomes to be fairies and all that other kind of stuff? All the creatures? I don't know the right word. I don't mean to be.
And use those right terms, Victoria.
I threw apples outside. I mean,
yeah. And
they like
the
apples.
It's going well.
They do.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some debate at points about what exactly falls into that umbrella term. And you will definitely run into some people today who will argue that fairy is a very specific type of being, usually based more on like modern fiction than the actual folklore. But when we look at the actual folklore and the older material, fairy has kind of always been used as this catch-all term. It sort of applies to anything that's not a human ghost, but supernatural and otherworldly, that sort of interacts with our world in different, usually sort of specific kinds of ways. And they can be negative, they can be positive, they can be in an animal form or a human-like form, or, it's a huge range of beings that kind of fall under this label. And that's been true. The word has been in use for, I think, 700 years. So,
wow.
Yeah, pretty much as long as it's been in the English language, that's kind of how it's been used.
So do they have different type of fairies? Like, would a water fairy, would that be like a silky? Is that the right one? Is that like a mermaid? Or are they different?
There are definitely people now who sort of define them or categorize them by the 4 classical elements. It's like earth, air, fire, and water. Traditionally, we don't find that so much in folklore, but there definitely is the concept of the Selkies, who are a type of sort of a shapeshifter. They can take a human form, or they can take the form of a seal. Selkie is actually related to an older Scottish and older English word for seals.
Oh.
And when they're in the water, they look like a seal. When they come on land, they can take that seal skin off, kind of like we would take off a coat, and then they're human underneath. And there's a huge range of stories relating to them. And then you do have the more traditional mermaid sorts of stories with the whole, half human, half not human. Aquatic.
Luring men to their deaths,
So I guess my question is, how does, because you're talking about mermaids, how do mermaids fall under that umbrella of fairies?
By this broader definition, this sort of catch-all term use of it, pretty much anything that isn't clearly, like I said, a human ghost, not what we would consider in modern terms demonic or angelic necessarily, but has a connection to the other world, which is this sort of reality that's not the human world, but very similar to it, separated from it. And these otherworldly beings have this ability to sort of travel back and forth between our world and their own world. And that usually is what we would call fairies. So stories with fairies are usually about these beings who aren't necessarily from here, but can come here or interact with us here. And that would include things like Selkies, Things like the more Celtic language speaking cultural mermaids. I can't really speak to the Mediterranean ones because I don't know as much about their folklore, so I don't want to, go out of my lane on that one. But the ones that we find in like Ireland and Wales, the Lake Maidens, for example, we would put those in that category of fairies because they fit that broader definition.
So are fairies found all around the world?
I think they are. I think that we can find beings that fit that sort of description pretty much in every culture. I think anytime you have humans, you're going to have stories of fairies, stories of these otherworldly beings. Obviously, every culture is going to have their own names for them, and terms that we would, in English, would translate as fairy. In Korea, for example, they're called yojang. So, that's if you are reading Korean folk tales in English translations, that's what they're going to call a fairy. So it's sort of the closest equivalent we would have there. And you find that, I think, in every culture.
There's something I've always wondered, and did Mike leave us? Anyway, are fairies and humans able to mate? And if they were to have children, would they be offspring or like a hybrid, or would they be otherkin? Or because I have so many friends that look like fairies, and I draw the Renaissance stuff. Okay.
So, what does a fairy look like, Victoria? There are so many different forms and beings.
The ones I know, pointed face, they really don't act like they belong in this dimension. They're very ethereal, hanging out in nature all the time. They just look like fairies, big rounded almond-shaped eyes, pointed ears, wings. No, I'm just kidding. No, but they're beautiful. I mean, they're gorgeous people, and they just don't exactly look like they belong right here, but they do. I don't know.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
See, she gets me.
And I wasn't laughing at the original question, but believe it or not, this is the top most common question I get asked all the time.
Okay, interesting.
Inquiring minds want to know, I guess.
Between this and Darby O'Gill, I'm batting. What is it? Batting 1,000? Is that?
Yeah,
pretty good.
But this is a subject people have a lot of interest in. So I can't speak to the people personally, of course. From a folkloric perspective, what we find in the stories, the answer would be yes. Basically, that we have a lot of stories of humans and various otherworldly beings, specific types of otherworldly beings, who produce children. I guess would be the G-rated way to say it. Selkie stories I had mentioned before, that we have a lot of those, and one of the main premises we see in those stories is it's called the Selkie Bride. And it's this female Selkie who comes on land, and usually it's a fisherman, finds her seal skin and takes it, and she can't go back to the water without that.
I've heard that
one. Yep. So then she ends up going with him and becoming his wife, and they usually have, multiple children together before she eventually finds the seal skin again, and then returns to the sea.
See, that's why I was wondering, would it be in their DNA and then just passed down through the lineage? And my daughter's friend works at Starbucks. Maybe she's a fairy. I don't know, but
depending on how you look at the stories. Certainly the Selkie stories, and we find those across a range of different cultures. Certainly the Selkie stories, there's the idea that you kind of have that then passed down. That actually used to be in Orkney and the Shetland Isles, how they would explain if children had webbed hands or feet. It was because, the obvious answer is that they're part Selkie. Right. Or, they have Selkie ancestry. So it's definitely something, logically.
Totally off subject for a moment. Morgan, I know I had you adjust your volume a little bit just before we went live because you were at a very different level than Victoria, and you're at the same output. But I've been trying to adjust on my end ever since. Can you go ahead and bump it back up just a little bit?
Sure. Is that
That's
any
my
better?
Yeah, we can go with that. We'll try that.
it's my fairy euphoria. Sorry. Fairies. No.
So let me ask you something,
Sure.
Morgan. So, kind of going back to Irish folklore, you hear a lot of the stories about the ring forts and the fairy rings. Of course, there's the tragedy with Michael and Bridget Cleary, and so how much of that is I guess where the origins of that come from for somebody back in the late 1800s to still have those true diehard beliefs that fairies are going to come basically be a changeling and take the place of a human being.
I don't think anyone knows for certain, specifically with the changeling stories, which are the idea, of course, that the fairies will come and steal not just children, for the record, although that's sort of the more famous one that people talk about, babies and children. But as you mentioned with Bridget Cleary, she was an adult. She was a married woman,
Right.
who her husband, she took ill, and her husband suspected she was a changeling while she was sick, and of course ended up murdering her, which is why it's such
tragic.
a famous
Yeah.
story. Yeah. I don't know if we know for certain where that specific idea comes from. There's been quite a lot of theories about it over the last 100 or so years. Fairy beliefs more generally, we know go back at least, I believe it's 1500 years in Ireland. Is the oldest reference we have to those types of beings. So it's a very old belief, and it's a very ingrained belief. There haven't, thankfully, that I know of, been any deaths related to changeling beliefs in quite a while. Bridget Cleary was the late 19th century. But, there is still a very strong sense of belief in these beings, that they are real, that they do exist, in Ireland and Iceland, places like that, to the point where you still see, in the 21st century, roads being rerouted so that they don't disturb territory that belongs to these beings, or specific objects that are thought to belong to these beings. So it's certainly a very, very living belief. It's not something that's sort of, lost to history, so to speak.
So how would you know if a fairy circle was still active or if it had been abandoned? I know they're supposed to dance around, and that's what does the mushroom thing or whatever, but or makes the circle, the dark circle or anything. How would you know if it's still active if you can't really see them?
If you can't see them, because of course some humans can. There's this belief that some people have what's called the second sight, the ability to see these things. And there's also certain things like a four-leaf clover, supposed to be a talisman that will let you see them. But if you don't have things like that, if you can't see them, there's really no way to know for sure if it's active or not. Generally speaking, the mushrooms or the darker grass would be sort of an after the fact sign. It's sort of a thing that happens to show that they have been there. Stepping into an active fairy ring is sort of a very risky business, as it were. Although, again, we see so much cultural variation here. So, if you happen to be in the northern part of France, where they also have a lot of these fairy beliefs, the idea there is if you step into a fairy circle, probably nothing too terrible is going to happen to you. If it's an active circle, you might be invited to join them for a night of dancing, but you'll probably be let go fairly easily. In other places, however, Wales, we have a lot of stories of people who stepped into an active fairy ring, dance the night away, have a great time, leave the next morning and find out actually 10 years have passed, 50 years have passed, 100 years have passed, which is not so much a good thing for them. And then in other places, Ireland, Scotland, etc., we see this idea that if you step into an active fairy circle, depending on how the fairies feel about you kind of busting into their party, they might make you dance until you die of exhaustion. They might just take you away forever, and do, whatever they decide to do with you. Or, if you do successfully get out, you might end up sort of wasting away over the next few months because you just can't quite let it go, let the experience go. So usually not a good idea to try to find an active one.
Do they ever
not
go
that
back?
This doesn't stop people.
Like if they've had one, like if they were dancing and you see a fairy ring and they've gone, do they ever go back to it? Do they revisit?
Yeah. If they have a specific place they really like, and you'll see sort of fairy rings being common occurrences in that area. So that's definitely a possibility.
Cool. Very nice. Okay.
Now, I've seen a couple of things stateside, like along the Illinois River, and also in New York, in the Finger Lake area, back behind the Hinsdale House. I don't know if you're familiar with that area. Things that I would call fairies, like along the Illinois River. It was a yellow illuminated ball of light, but it transformed from something that was just like a bar of light on the ground, and then this wavy thing happened, and all of a sudden it was in the air, and it was this translucent ball of light. That was the one along the Illinois River. And then in New York, it was these little pinpricks of blue lights that were coming down out of the woods, which was absolutely fascinating. It was in late September. So is this the type of...
I just totally lost the last part of whatever you said because I couldn't hear you.
I didn't hear him either.
Yeah. I don't think we threw enough apples outside.
It's because I hit the fence and I spooked the dog next door.
Okay. We tried.
Yeah. He had an amazing story when he went up to the Hinsdale house. I don't know if you saw the video or anything, but they put apples out. That's why we always keep apples. And in the morning when they woke up, I cannot read his lips. Something had taken a big bite out of the apple.
So. Nice. Yeah, they do definitely like apples. And to answer the first part of the question, which I heard before we kind of lost the sound there, there is some debate about whether we have sort of
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
All right.
Yep.
There we go.
It was the fairies. I mean, the good neighbors.
It was the good neighbors. Making sure we know that they're
Well,
here.
Morgan, you told us before the show that this happens. You have all kinds of tech issues when you come on these type of shows. But it's happening on my end.
My audio is not messing up. I put the apples outside.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. Well, I should say I don't know what it is. I do know what it is. But yeah, every time I talk about this subject in an interview, there's always some tech shenanigans that go on. So
yeah.
Yay. It happened again. Well, I have a question about fairies. Unless you have more, Mike. You were telling the story about Hinsdale.
Well, yeah, basically my question, to go along with that was, is this the type of thing that you would expect from fairy activity, and how prevalent is that over here in the United States?
Yep. Certainly that lines up with stories that we see in places like Ireland, for example. The idea of fairy lights, the idea of not so much in Ireland, but more in England, the will-o'-the-wisp. So those certainly would, resonate with that sort of folklore. There's a bit of a debate currently about whether we have European fairy beings in North America. I'm not sure how the debate got started, to be honest, because we actually have a couple hundred years worth of folklore in the United States and Canada, in particular, relating to European fairy beings being seen and experienced here. I just wanted to mention, though, that not everyone agrees that they are over here. We also, of course, have a multitude of similar types of beings that are native to North America. So that makes it really interesting to dig into people's experiences here, because you have a lot of options for what it could be. But we do have, Irish and Welsh and Scottish fairy beings that have been seen and experienced over here, going back into the 18th century. We have records of them. So, I think there's pretty strong evidence that there's some of that going on over here. Certainly what you describe would fit some of the stories that we also see in Europe. But there's a lot of things out there.
That's for sure. That's for sure. I do want to get to some of these questions that have come in from the chat room. So we'll take a couple minutes to do a few of these. And then, Victoria, I know you have a lot of questions. So this first one is from Sarah Youssef. Do fairies act with seasonal behavior?
Seasonal fairies is another thing that's recently gotten fairly popular, I guess. So there's an aspect that we see sort of in what you call modern folklore that attributes sort of seasonal qualities to fairies in a very specific sort of way. What we see in the older folklore isn't quite this idea of like spring fairies and summer fairies and winter fairies and that specifically. But there definitely is an idea that they have some connection or tie to sort of our cycle throughout the year. So there's specific times of year around the 1st of May, around the 1st of November, that they're said to be sort of extra active. And there's certain times of year that they're supposed to be moving house from one location to another, again, where they're kind of extra active. So we sort of see that seasonal tie-in in that sense. Certain things around midwinter and midsummer, that's the main time for those beings to be out and getting into mischief, or worse than mischief. But so we do have that kind of seasonal aspect.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. From Tanya Sargisian, are there fairy courts?
Oh, I don't know if we can cover this in half an hour.
So I guess that's a yes.
It is. I've actually I presented a paper on this at Ohio State University.
Oh, wow.
They had a Fairies in the Fantastic conference in 2019. So you have asked this question to the right person.
Brief summation, perhaps?
Yeah. There are, but not generally in the way I think that we would understand them, the people who are familiar with the concept. We have specific folklore from Scotland that relates to two fairy courts, the Seelie Court and the Unseelie Court. The Seelie Court, Seelie is a word in Scots, which means like happy, blessed, lucky. So these particular beings would be that. They would be the ones that are more benevolent generally towards humans. And then we have the Unseelie, who are kind of the antithesis of that. Unseelie in Scots meaning, unfortunate, unlucky, ungodly, all that fun stuff. So we have these sort of two diametrically opposed courts. Where I say that people don't always totally understand the fullness of this concept is that it's not so much a court in the sense of if you are one of the Seelie fairies, then that is it. You are that for life. You ride or die. And if you're Unseelie, then that's it. That's what you are. They're kind of permeable. It's more like sort of a political affiliation where it can change in circumstances and in time. So we have stories about beings that would generally be considered Unseelie, for example, because they're prone to, eating people, for example.
Wow.
But who in other stories can be more benevolent, depending on the circumstances, and would then have sort of a different category. And the same thing, we have beings like the Scottish brownie, which is fairly well known, sort of that helpful house spirit that does your chores for you kind of thing. But if you make them angry and insult them either by sort of questioning the quality of their work or giving them new clothing, because that offends them, then they sort of will go to that other side and become malicious and cause a lot of damage. So it's really not this sort of rigid concept. And we see that specifically in Scotland. If you go to someplace like Ireland, they have fairy courts, but they're courts around a specific fairy king or fairy queen. And they don't have that layer of sort of benevolence or malevolent to them. It's just they're, whatever grouping of fairy is loyal to this particular queen in this particular place would be that particular court. So I think that's as concise as I can summarize that.
Appreciate that. That had a good response down in the chat there. You're talking a little bit about that in there, so that's great. And then we'll take this one more for now and toss it back to Victoria. This is from Rick Gabber. He says, I just found out that I'm 77.6% Irish a while back. What kind of book would you recommend to learn of my Irish culture and about fairy folk? So I have to toss it up here because this is your new dictionary of fairies, which came out last year.
Yep, that one came out last February. Do not let the dictionary part put you off in the title. It's more of a sort of overview of a variety of different fairy beings and beliefs and concepts related to them. It's just set up in what was supposed to be an easy to use dictionary format. So alphabetical order, basically. That would certainly be one option.
But you have a lot of books on fairies.
I do. I have another one called Fairies, A Guide to the Celtic Fair Folk, which is a sort of a good starter intro to fairy folklore. More generally, if you're looking for Irish specifically, definitely want to look into the mythology. There's quite a bit of that. There's some good translations out there that you can try to get. There's some good options for resources, places like Duchess.ie. I'm going to spell that because I realize most people listening to this probably do not speak Irish. DUCHAS.ie. It's sort of a collection of folklore and beliefs and material from about 100 years ago. Really fascinating, but lots of stuff in there. There's some good blogs and websites. There's a gentleman named Michael Fortune on YouTube who has a series of videos, specifically Irish folklore, that are just amazing. Definitely worth checking out. There's a site called Mythical Ireland, run by a gentleman named Anthony Murphy. Lots of Irish folklore and mythology, sort of general beliefs in there. So all of those would be good places to start. Let me see. Laura O'Brien just had a book come out about Maeve, who's one of the mythical queens. That would be another, interesting way to go. You have quite a lot of options, particularly when it comes to the Irish material. I do always recommend that people try to start with people who are in Ireland or from Ireland, because they're going to have a better understanding and a stronger connection to the material. And yes, I say that as someone who's from the U.S., but it's true. Always go to the source.
Yeah, certainly. And which, it's one of the reasons why we're going to Ireland this summer. It's going to be absolutely amazing. But I did link.
An amazing place.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that. So I did link down in the description for those that are watching on YouTube. Down in the description below, I did put a link to Morgan's book that we just showed, the new Dictionary of Fairies. But if you go into that link and just click on her name, you'll see all. You said 35, right?
Yeah, 35 so far. Yeah,
35 books so far on, and it's not just fairies. You have some fiction and other things as well, which is interesting.
Yep. I have a small fiction, urban fantasy fiction series. I write about different Irish deities, Irish mythology. As you were mentioning just before the show started, my super exciting personal hobby is translating Old and Middle Irish into English. So I have a couple things out that are translations of the original myths into English.
Oh, interesting.
Everyone needs a super weird, obscure hobby. So
That's an interesting one. So, Victoria, take it away.
One. Okay, how do I start? I have many questions. Okay, how would you, hypothetically, draw fairies into you? Like around here, I have little wind chimes. I throw food out. Talk to fairies when I go outside. I have friends who are absolutely terrified of fairies. And so whenever I do any sort of candle meditation or anything, I always make an offering outside, food and wine or something, or meat or whatever. But I had a dream once where, this is going to sound weird, I was like walking through the forest and some fairies kind of assisted me through the forest quite quickly. But they're all like, hi, good to see you. Bye, now get out. So I'm not afraid of fairies, but all my other friends are terrified. And I'm an air sign, so I'm thinking, like we're kind of, homies. So how would you draw fairies in? Do they prefer cream and butter over the sweets? Because I always did the sweets and stuff, because I'm thinking, they're like hummingbirds, they're going to need the sugar. And yeah, that's it for now. Oh, and fairy, what's it called? Fairycraft. Can you do fairycraft? Is that completely into itself? Is that like a whole entity, or can you incorporate that with other types of meditations and whatever you want to do?
Yes to both of those.
Okay.
It can certainly be its own thing, whole unto itself, or you can incorporate it into other things.
Okay.
It's sort of flexible that way. How to draw them in? I think you kind of touched on the two main ways, which is, ask them and make offerings to them, leave things for them. Very reciprocity based are the fair folk. Folklore tells us that. People's experiences tell us that. I do want to touch a little on what you were saying with people being afraid of them versus not being afraid of them. Mm-hmm. There certainly is a strong belief in a lot of places that they deserve respect, and that you do want to be careful with them, because they do have the potential to, either help or harm. It can go different ways. And I think that some people definitely do take that to that sort of extreme of being afraid of them. Mm-hmm. Some people take it to the other extreme of, sort of just treating them like, cutesy little
no, never under
mice. I don't know. Well, just you'll find both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, like the flower fairies. Those those drawings. Okay, they're cute.
Yep. Cicely Mary Barker's flower fairies. Yes. Yep. There's sort of this dichotomy in how people perceive fairies, where you have the more popular culture-based views, which came out of the Victorian era and fiction and movies and modern entertainment and theosophy and a couple other things, that really do sort of paint fairies as kind of powerless and cute, needing human assistance with things. It sort of puts them in that realm. Mm-hmm. And then you have more the traditional folklore and folk beliefs, and what we find in the cultures, like I've mentioned, that still have these active beliefs, where they're definitely seen as being much more something you would want to use caution around.
Right.
What I usually tell people when the subject of how can I connect to this, or what should I do, you really want to think of them the way you would think of other humans. Mm-hmm. You're not going to walk up to a total strange human on the street, I hope, and treat them like a cute little flower fairy. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you don't want to live in absolute terror of every human you meet, because that's also dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. So you just want to have that respect, and
I try and treat things the way I want to be treated. People, animals, whatever.
Yeah, and that's the best way to do it. And like we've mentioned, this is the word fairy is a catch-all term, so you can certainly engage with types of fairy beings that are on the more sort of benevolent end of things. And some people will only ever interact with, a small group, and it will be on that particular, type, which is fine. Just, be aware that there's a lot more out there. There's a lot out there in general.
How do you feel about Brian Froud? Is that his name?
Brian Froud.
Froud?
I love Brian Froud's artwork.
Oh, I love that book. But he has a deck of tarot cards. They're just beautiful.
Yep. He actually has 2 oracle decks, but I think the second one's been out of print for a little while.
Oh.
Heart of Fairy, I think it was called.
Sounds like a challenge.
I'm betraying my love of Brian Froud here by how much I know about this.
No, he's great. I mean, I remember that book from high school. It was great.
Yep. I love the book. I loved the movie Labyrinth.
Mm-hmm.
She did all the designs and stuff for her. So, yeah, I'm definitely stan the Brian Froud. So
yes. So, do fairies would they prefer cream and butter, from what I've read, or the sweets?
Yep. Generally speaking, what we find, and this is across cultures, even outside of European cultures, I've found this in other places as well that have these types of foods. Dairy products are always super popular. So milk, butter, bread, cake, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Those tend to be kind of the main things that they are offered across this whole spectrum. We also sometimes see things like honey, fruit.
So the more natural.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. What I usually tell people if they want to offer something sweet is to go with honey, mm-hmm. or something along those lines, and try to avoid anything that's too chemical or, too far removed from that sort of fresh, natural. I sound like a commercial here. But
no, I was just.
It's all natural.
I'm going to keep the mead for me now. So we have a meadery.
They do like alcohol.
Irish whiskey.
I was just saying, in Irish folk belief, yeah. I will specify that there are some American spirits, Native American spirits, that we might consider fairy-like, or equivalent to fairies, that are actually very anti-alcohol. You'd offer them like tobacco or cornmeal. But in Ireland, there's actually sort of a long-standing idea that if you make your own mead or whiskey or alcohol of any sort, the top sort of percent of whatever you make belongs to the fairies. And so that would always be sort of, poured out and given to them.
You're tithing your mead?
Basically, yeah. My grandfather actually, every time he would drink, if he was outdoors, he would pour the first little bit onto the ground and say it was the fairies' portion.
Yep.
So
there you go.
It's just a belief people have.
Why not?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, if it's a tradition, I always enjoy other people's traditions. So we do have some other. What's that?
Are we going to be pouring stuff all over Ireland?
There you go. Everywhere we go. Yeah. So we do have a few other questions here from the chat that I want to get to in the last 15 minutes here of the show.
Sure.
From Robert Hanna, could fairies have something to do with people going missing in national parks and forests?
The missing 411 discussion.
Yeah.
Yes. I think this is going to be one of those things that's going to be debated for a very long time. My personal theory is, besides the cases that are clearly like there's human foul play going on, or, some other explanation that can be found, I do think there's a percentage of the missing 411 cases that very closely fit the folklore that we see for fairy abductions. Things like people who were in very familiar territory, who there was no reason for them to get lost or wander off or disappear. Particularly some of the missing 411 cases that involve children, where the child is returned or does reappear unharmed, but an impossible distance away, and things like that fit the criteria that we find in older folklore for fairy abductions. So I tend to fall in the yes, it could be fairies.
But not every case.
I don't think if we looked at anything, every single 100% of the time would always be,
Right. There are multiple explanations for a lot of things. So.
Yeah.
So
I say that about hauntings too.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. From Sarah Youssef, is there variation of personality in these otherworldly beings like we see in people?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely, yeah. And again, that's, experience and anecdotal accounts and across the folklore. You have this whole huge range, just like you would with humans, where, some just seem to be kind of nice by nature. Some are just grumpy. Some are mean. Some can start out kind of not friendly, but can be persuaded to be nicer.
So they each have their own individuality.
Yeah. And when you look at the stories of specific type fairies, I shouldn't say type, specific fairies in Ireland, the named ones, which are usually the kings and queens, but they all clearly have distinctive personalities. They're definitely individuals.
Okay. From Tanya Sargissian, have you performed fairy magic?
Personally,
it's a whole nother discussion, right?
I've written whole books about that, actually.
Right.
Yes, personally I have. The spirituality that I practice is a type of pagan witchcraft, which is based around fairy beliefs, kind of the elevator pitch for it. So I definitely have performed what you would call fairy magic, fairy-based magic, however we're defining this.
Okay. Well, reading your bio, it has there's some mention in there of the Irish fairy faith and what have you. So I imagine there's some practicing of different ceremonies and things like that in there.
Yep. I think it's the more you get into this, the folklore aspect, the belief to it, it's hard not to start to see the value in certain things. Offering them cream and honey, for example, or, doing things that are considered respectful. And then it kind of goes from there sometimes, I think. So.
Okay. Victoria?
How do you feel about fairy depiction first of all, are elves fairies or do they fall in that category?
They would, yeah.
Okay. How do you feel about the depiction in like pop culture and video games, especially? Because I've seen a lot of dark stuff as I'm walking down the hall. My daughter's playing these video games. I'm like, what are you doing? Has it changed? I mean, it's not sticking to the true folklore. Okay.
Yeah. You are hitting on all of my favorite topics that are not easy to talk about quickly.
We can be besties. Okay.
I'm actually working on another paper exactly on that, how pop culture has kind of affected certain things. But I think that there's certainly some that are entertaining. I write urban fantasy myself. I love urban fantasy. It's my favorite genre to read. But it definitely can have a negative effect on the folklore, more in the sense of when people take it as if it were legitimate cultural folklore. There's a lot of stuff out there that kind of puts itself out as, you're reading this novel and it says, oh, this is the Scottish whatever. And it's not at all. It's completely made up by the author, or they're using a name or a term, but then totally redefining it. And I'm not against the creative process, obviously. I just think people have to be aware that, there's a difference between modern fiction and folklore.
So they're doing like an artistic license with it, basically.
Yeah. Speaking of the gaming in World of Warcraft, I'll pick on for an example. the elves have very, very large pointed ears that kind of extend like, way off their heads.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not something we see in the folklore at all. And I could get into a much longer discussion about where the idea of them having pointed ears at all comes from. But even putting that aside, when we do see it in more modern accounts and stories, it's basically like, on Star Trek, how the Vulcans have pointed ears, or, Tolkien's elves in the movies. They're a little more subtle than what video games show. But because of what we see in the video games, I'm seeing more and more people who are writing modern fiction who are using that description, who are, going with this really oversized, almost animalistic ears. So there definitely is a strong influence between what people have in fiction and gaming, and then how they incorporate that into what they believe, or sort of what they then put out there.
Yeah, what they base it off of their version of fact or their truth.
Mm-hmm.
Totally different.
Exactly. And people just need to be aware that that's fine, but if you're reading the actual folklore, you're talking to people in places that still have these beliefs, what they're going to be saying and what you're going to be reading is going to be very different from what you might have read in your favorite novel or played in your favorite game.
Well, let me throw out this idea because the folklore goes back long time. What if when that folklore was written, again, I believe this is all based off of some sort of truth, some nuggets of something that were out there, and I've seen things with my own eyes. But what if some of that folklore was today, where we're taking an idea and making it bigger and larger? What if some of that folklore is kind of the same thing but done 1,000 years ago?
Oh, sure. And I have no doubt that some of what we have today for the folklore has been amplified like that. It's a story that's been retold and kind of grown in the telling. The only real difference that I would point out is that when people write fiction today, when authors write novels today to sell, they're not basing it on an experience. They're not trying to tell any sort of real truth. They're just trying to tell an entertaining story that's going to sell to the market. And, I just think people have to be cautious in that, in how much truth they're reading into something that was purely meant for entertainment. And there are arguments that some of the older folklore did serve a practical purpose. Stories of things like kelpies and hags and different types of fairy beings that would drown people, basically. Some folklorists believe originated in a way for parents in particular to keep children away from dangerous areas of water.
Some practical safety
river.
tips. Yeah.
Right. Don't go near that river because something might eat you is a little more persuasive than don't go near that river because it might be dangerous in a vague sort of way.
Right.
Or at least theoretically. I don't know. Children never listen to anything, so.
Right, but it makes sense. You're sitting down with the child at night as they're going to bed, and you tell them the story. Well, this is why we don't go near that river, and you start talking about some creature or whatever that's in there. So it makes complete sense.
Could a changeling, from what I understand, they were saying like a human baby was replaced with by a fairy baby. So could a changeling be a way of coping with perhaps a child who was not, might have been born with some sort of difficulty? Just a coping mechanism, like a degree of neutralization for the parents or the family to say, well, it's a fairy, it's not mine.
Yep. The changeling is a little more complicated, but generally, yes. And there certainly are quite a few theories that it was a way to explain a range of physical, medical issues, behavioral issues, psychological issues. Because again, it wouldn't apply just to children. We would also see it with adults. We'd mentioned Bridget Cleary earlier. Most people these days who studied the case think she probably had pneumonia. She had fallen ill and seen the actual doctor and also some folk practitioners, and it seems most likely that she, that was the illness that she had. She had pneumonia. But whatever was happening while she was sick was enough of a change that her husband decided she wasn't his wife anymore, that she'd been replaced with this changeling, which of course led to her death then. So it certainly has been used, that we know of, to explain medical things that people just didn't want to accept.
Right. It's just an easy way to cope with something that's just so hard to cope with. It's, because I joke with Mike all the time. Oh, Mercury. Just
yeah.
Yeah, you were warning me a little bit earlier this evening too.
Yes, we're in the shadow.
And so was Nicole earlier today. So yeah, it's. I've been warned doubly that Mercury is upon us.
There's no escape.
We're in the shadow.
Yeah,
we still have time.
So
just get ready.
A couple minutes left in the show here. We were talking about books and folklore and writing and written works earlier. So Betty Lange was wondering, Morgan, if you're aware of Fairy magazine and if you like it.
I'm trying to think of which one she's talking about, because I'm aware of several.
There's a few? Okay.
I think one had changed their name recently, though. It might be going by something different now. Enchantments, maybe? The one I'm thinking of that's called Fairy Magazine, I like it in the aesthetic of it. Absolutely gorgeous photographs, some interesting stories. It definitely tends to lean more on the beautiful side of fairy, I guess we'll say. Just overall, that is kind of their aesthetic. But they do show them in a sort of diverse array of forms. They do show them as more human-sized, and that's all stuff I'm always going to like, because that is closer to the folklore. So if that's the one you're talking about.
If that's the one. So, and then we had a number of people, ask about, different types of entities possibly being fairies. So, Nick Moulet was one, Pungi Fungi was one. So like leprechauns, water babies, gnomes. So are these all different types of fairies?
In the broad sense, yes. Yeah. We would be using the term fairy or the term elf as a generic for kind of all of these things. Leprechauns, which are they kind of have a modern version that people are familiar with, and then there's a much older folkloric version which is different from the more modern one. But they would be in that broad category of fairy beings, or at least the Irish version of those types of beings. It's used as such a catch-all term that pretty much anything you can name as a specific type of fairy is going to fall under that more general catch-all term. Elf has taken on a little bit more of a specific meaning, although there's several different types depending on which culture we're talking about. But historically, it was used synonymously, interchangeably with fairy, because fairy wasn't a specific term. So you'll see sources that talk about, fairies, which are the same thing as elves, which are the same thing as imps or incubi in some cases. They're kind of broadly equated across this sort of spectrum of types of beings.
Would otherkin be in that realm too, or is that something totally different?
Some of them. Otherkin is a type of community of people who believe that they either are reincarnated non-human beings, incarnate non-human beings, they have the spirit of a non-human being,
Gotcha.
et cetera. But otherkin is a whole range, kind of like the word fairy is sort of a general term.
Okay.
Otherkin is kind of a general term, so you'll have otherkin who identify as Therian, as wolves, as angels, as demons, as all sorts of different specific things. So, yes, but only a portion, I guess, would be the answer to the question.
All right.
Gotcha.
Well, we're at the end of our show. We're at our hour mark. So, Morgan, I really want to thank you for coming on the show. And I know we're really just skimming over this topic. We could really go down some rabbit
There's
holes, of
so
course,
much
here on.
to it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, can you please go ahead and tell everybody where they can find you, your books, and all of that fun stuff? I'm going to go ahead and put New Dictionary of Fairies back up on the screen here.
Sure. My books you can get at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, most brick and mortar bookstores. If you ask for them, they can be ordered. Where can you find me? I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, all under my name. So just Morgan Daimler, and you will find me in any of those places. I try to be pretty straightforward with my social media stuff. So I just use my normal full name. That's it. Not hard to search.
And we do have a link down in the description here on YouTube to go ahead and get that particular book. But again, you can also click on her name once you get to that, because that's a link to Amazon. You can find the rest of Morgan's books, and that link is also on Facebook as well when we posted the event. So please go ahead and check it out. And there's already people in the chat saying that they will be finding you on Facebook. So there you go.
Awesome. You will definitely find me if you look there. And I should add, I do have a YouTube channel. So,
oh, great. Yeah. What's the YouTube channel?
It's just Morgan Daimler.
Morgan Daimler. There you go. Everything's Morgan Daimler.
Makes
it real easily.
Easy to find.
Makes it real
easy.
easy.
The truth is, I just want to make sure I can remember it.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes total sense. All right. Well, thank you very much, Morgan, for coming on and talking all things fairies. This has been absolutely fantastic, and we'll definitely have to have you back and go deeper down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you for all the information. Thank you. I appreciate it.
There's definitely so much more we can talk about.
Oh, certainly.
Well, I found you on Twitter today, so, you know.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. You have a great evening, Morgan.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, everybody. Morgan Daimler. Well, that was really interesting.
It was. I have more questions, but she answered a lot of them.
And I knew you would have a lot of questions with her, so that was great. And just the fact that I've had some experiences. We're going to Ireland. It's just it was great to have her on board. So
perfect timing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, all right, let's go ahead and get into all the shout outs and that great stuff. So, real quick here, Deep Down the Rabbit Hole Patreon patrons, Tom McNicholas, Andrew Cox, and Joe Chandler. Thanks for being Deep Down the Rabbit Hole Patreon patrons. Absolutely appreciate that, and thank you to the rest of the Patreon patrons. I did want to go ahead and because I posted it earlier this evening on Facebook. The second edition of A Walk in the Shadows will be coming out on Thursday. People are asking me all kinds of questions. Is it just you're changing the book cover, or what's going on with it? Is it a completely different book? So, okay, here's the deal. Yes, it does have a new book cover, but there's about 40 additional pages within this book. So it's a second edition, not a part 2. So I've added about 40 more pages of content. I've reworked a few things that were in there, cleaned a few things up, and what have you. So there's also some sneak peeks into the Shadow Dimension docu-series with that. So there's a couple of interviews and something that happened during the investigation at the Conjuring House that's included in it. There's actually our very own Victoria Monday has a snippet of an interview in that book as well. Yeah.
Just a snippet.
Yeah. So that'll be coming out on Thursday.
I'm ready for the coloring book.
Yeah, you still want the coloring book. I mean, we're talking shadow people. Just get your black crayon and do that.
Yeah. Therapy. Yeah.
There you go. There you go. All right, so let's go ahead and get to the shout-outs here. We will hit this participants tab and see what we have in here. Actually, a lot of people in the participants tab tonight. Good job, YouTube. All right, so we got Adam Tillery's in the house. Thank you once again, Adam. He's not even lurking. He's right there. Andrew in Gnome's Trucking Express. Great to see you, Andrew Cox. There's Auntie Coco. Thanks for joining us once again. Baby Cakes. Thanks for joining us tonight. Betty's Grand Old Folks, great to see you, Betty Lange. Debbie 08, great to see you again. Donna Liska, thank you for joining us again. There's Alina the Fam. Empath Medium, thanks for joining us tonight. Hunter Road Media's Fairy Queen. I mean, the subject tonight, very apropos for Diane Hilbert there.
She'd be your good neighbor queen.
Yeah, absolutely.
I left her an apple.
Yeah, some other term that they would appreciate more. I don't know. I guess some are okay with it, but others want a different term. I'm not sure how that works.
I need to study before we go to Ireland.
We do. We don't want to tick off any Irish fairies while we're over there.
No.
Helen Espinoza, thanks for joining us tonight. Jennifer Bloomer, thank you as well. Jill Nimchinsky, thanks for joining us. Katie Palmer, great seeing you down there again. Christine Louvois, thanks for joining us tonight. Nick Graves, great to see you down there. There's Nick Moulet as well, and Fungi.
Woohoo!
Right. Yeah, speaking
I've
of
heard that all year.
Speaking of all year, yeah. The year just started. Yeah, all year. Yeah, all 2021. Haven't seen Fungi. But yeah, speaking of fairy rings, there you go.
Did it just get bright in here? Because I just got it.
There's Rick Gabbert. He's in the house, as well as Robert Hanna. Sandy Miller, great to see you down there. There's Sarah Youssef. Stanton Journeys, that's Chris Stanton. Good to see you down there. Tammy Highsmith, thanks for joining us once again. TFT Tarot for today. Thanks for joining us once again. There's Tim Schoen. Do this for Tim.
Oh, yeah, Tim. I remember him.
Yeah. This episode of Edge of the Rabbit Hole is brought to you by Haunted Road Roast. It helps young ghosts. There you go. All right. And Tanya Sargissian. Thank you for all the questions, guys. You guys had some good ones and absolutely appreciate it. I'll scroll through here and see if there are any more that the participants tab may have missed. But I think we're probably going to be good. So as far as Beyond the Shadows, I know people were asking about that last week. We're no longer doing that as a live stream here on Edge of the Rabbit Hole. We're going to be moving that to a live stream on a different platform. Still not quite set up yet, but you will get the audio podcast later this week, like I did last week. That came out as an audio podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, all those different platforms. So you'll get that again this weekend, as well as KGRA Radio, which is KGRADB.com. You can tune into that on midnight Saturday, and then Edge of the Rabbit Hole, you get midnight Friday out there on KGRA, as well as all the other podcast platforms. So, all right, everybody, I think that is going to wrap it up for this evening. So, all right, Victoria, you have a great night.
Thank you. You too. Go feed your fairies.
Gotta go feed the fairies. Yeah, I mean, mine at Hinsdale House, they like the apple.
That's what I'm saying. I put apples out one day, and there were just bites taken out of the top, and the whole apples were still there.
Yeah, mine it was like into the side. It was like a bite, but kind of it was burrowed into is what it looked like, and then there were like shreds of apple all over the place on the outside.
They don't eat the skin, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, they were kind of like digging in, throwing parts of it out, and eating more. Next time I'm going to put a camera on it, see what happens.
Ooh, that'd be fun. I'll put it in front of the doorbell. I can watch then.
There you go.
You have the Ring doorbell.
You got the ring light. Cool. Or the ring bell or whatever they call it. All right, everybody. Ring camera. Ring camera. Yeah.
Yes.
All right, everybody.
Yes. Okay.
Have a great night. We'll see you next week.
Bye.